The two German shepherds stood shoulder to shoulder in the middle of Sycamore Drive, blocking the yellow school bus like they had grown out of the pavement. Hackles up, feet locked. Officer Janet Lawson kept shouting their names, kept snapping the empty leashes, and neither dog turned its head. They stared straight through the windshield at Phil Carver, and something in that stare made the veteran driver's stomach fold in half. He had never, in 23 years behind that wheel, seen an animal refuse a road, the way those two were refusing him now. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments what part of the world you're listening from right now, and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss stories like this one. The morning fog still hung low over Millbrook, Ohio, when the whole thing began. Phil had done the Sycamore Drive stop so many times he could steer it in his sleep, and most mornings he practically did. He pulled up at 7:12 on the dot, 4 blocks past the old brick library, right where the maple tree leaned over the curb. 7 kids were already sitting on the vinyl bench seats behind him, 3 of them still half asleep, one of them chewing on the strap of her backpack. He had opened the folding door, tapped the mirror out of habit, and lifted his hand to wave the next group forward. That was when the shepherds broke from the sidewalk in a low, silent rush and planted themselves square in front of his hood. Janet Lawson came around the corner 2 seconds behind them, boots slapping the concrete, her breath fogging in short, hard puffs. 12 years on the K9 unit, and she had never been outrun by her own dogs, not once, not by a full step. Hector and Rex were the calmest working pair in the county. They had cleared warehouses, sniffed courthouses, ridden in the backs of hot cruisers all summer without so much as a whine. They obeyed hand signals from 30 feet away. They did not bolt. They did not ignore her. They did not do this. She skidded to a stop 10 feet from their tails and lowered her voice the way the trainer had taught her 15 years back. Steady, firm, no wobble. Hector, back. Rex, heel. Neither dog moved. Hector took one slow, deliberate step forward instead, closer to the front bumper, and pressed his flank against Rex's shoulder, as if to say the two of them were one wall now, and the wall was not moving. Phil killed the engine. In the sudden silence, he could hear his own pulse ticking in his ears. He climbed down the 2 rubber steps with the door still open, one hand braced on the railing, and stopped on the pavement with his jaw tight. He was already 7 minutes behind schedule, and the middle school bell rang at 7:40 on the button. He drew a breath to tell the officer to please, "Ma'am, get her dogs out of the road," so he could roll. He got as far as opening his mouth. Janet held up one flat hand. Not to him exactly, to the whole morning. She dropped to one knee in front of the bumper and clicked on her flashlight, and the little cone of yellow light swept slow along the undercarriage of the bus, along the greasy black axle, and the rusted brake lines, and the space between the wheel and the curb. That was when she heard it, something so small it might have been the wind moving in the storm drain. A breath, a whimper, a single hitch of air that did not belong to any dog or any engine. Curled against the inside of the front left wheel, tucked so close to the tire that her cheek was flat to the cold asphalt, was a little girl in a pink puffer coat. Her arms were wrapped around a stuffed rabbit that had lost one button eye. Her lashes were long and wet. Her lips were moving, but no sound was coming out. She could not have been older than 4. Phil made a sound that was not a word. His knees almost went. He grabbed the mirror bracket to hold himself up, and every drop of blood in his face went somewhere else. If he had touched the accelerator, if he had rolled forward the 6 inches he had been about to roll forward, if Hector and Rex had not planted themselves exactly where they had planted themselves, that child would have been under 3 tons of steel and rubber before he ever saw her. Janet radioed dispatch in a voice so calm it did not sound like her own. 10:45 on Sycamore at the corner of Wren. Child under a vehicle, conscious, need paramedics and a second unit, and hold every bus on the west route until further notice. She stayed on one knee and did not reach for the little girl yet. She talked to her instead, low and warm, the way she talked to a frightened puppy. "Hey, sweetheart. Hey, I'm Janet. Those big fluffy guys right there, that's Hector and that's Rex, and they came running to find you. You did such a good job holding still." The little girl's eyes opened all the way. They were the palest grey-green Phil had ever seen. She looked at Janet, and then she looked past Janet at Hector, and something moved across her small face that was not fear at all. It was recognition. Her lips shaped a single wobbling word. Puppy. Janet felt the word land in her chest, and then she felt it again, sharper because Hector's tail moved. Just once. A single low, controlled sweep. Rex sat down on the pavement without a command. Both dogs, in perfect sync, dropped their hackles. Paramedics were on the scene in 4.5 minutes. Officer Ray Delaney, Janet's partner on second watch, arrived 30 seconds after them and immediately began to sweep the surrounding lawns and hedgerows, because a 4-year-old does not simply appear under a school bus on her own. A woman in a jogging outfit stopped across the street with her hand over her mouth. 2 of the kids on the bus had their faces pressed to the windows. Phil sent them all back to their seats and told them gently that everything was going to be fine, that a little girl had gotten hurt and they needed to sit quiet for a minute. Ray called out from behind the picket fence of the corner house before he had gone 20 feet. He needed another medic. He needed one now. Lori Morrow was face down on the wet grass beside a plastic recycling bin, one arm flung out, her phone still gripped in her right hand. The screen was still lit. The last thing she had tried to dial was 911, and her thumb had made it to the 9, but not to the ones. She was breathing, barely. Her lips were the color of old paper. The second ambulance took her. The first one took Sophie. Janet climbed into the back of her cruiser with the little girl wrapped in a shock blanket. One small hand still curled tight in the fur behind Hector's ear, because the child had made a sound like tearing cloth the one time someone tried to take the dog away from her. Hector rode in the back seat with them, chin resting on Sophie's knee, and did not so much as blink for the whole 3 miles, to Millbrook General. Phil stood on the sidewalk with the folding door of the bus still hanging open and watched the ambulance turn the corner onto Elm. His hands were steady, his chest was not. He kept seeing the little pink coat. He kept seeing the empty stretch of pavement where the front tire had been about to be. He thought of his own daughter, grown now, married in Cincinnati, and of every morning of 23 years when he had trusted that what he could not see was not there. He climbed back up the steps. He checked his mirrors 4 times before he moved an inch, and then he drove the rest of the route so slow that a woman in a Subaru honked at him twice. By 9 that same morning, the story was on the county radio. By noon, a photograph of Hector, tongue out, ears up, sitting proudly beside a squad car, was on the front of the Millbrook Ledger website. By supper, someone had shared it in a Facebook group called Ohio Heroes, and it had traveled from Toledo to Cincinnati and back again. Everyone in the county knew the outline. K9 dog stop bus, save child. Everyone thought it was a heartwarming little miracle, a lucky accident, a story to smile about over coffee. Everyone was wrong. The story was only beginning, and the parts that were still to come were nothing like a miracle. At Millbrook General, Dr. Marcus Chen worked on Lori Morrow for the better part of an hour before her color came back. Blood pressure had crashed to almost nothing. Her heart had been beating like a scared bird against a window. He ordered a full panel, an EKG, a CT of her head, and then he stood back and let his residents run the numbers. When they came back to him, he read the sheet twice and set it face down on the counter. He walked out to the waiting room, where Officer Delaney was standing with his hat in his hands, and asked whether the woman had any family they could reach. Ray Delaney had been asking that question himself for the last 40 minutes and had not liked any of the answers. Lori Morrow's driver's license listed an address on Aspen Court, 2 blocks from the bus stop. The house had a mortgage in one name only. No spouse on record. Emergency contact was a woman named Eleanor Whitmore, listed as mother-in-law, with a phone number in the 419 area code. Ray had already called it. A woman with a voice like polished glass had picked up on the third ring, listened to him for exactly 11 seconds, and said, in a tone that could have frozen a river, that she would be there in 35 minutes and would appreciate it if no decisions concerning the child were made before her arrival. She arrived in 27. She parked a silver Lexus at an angle across 2 visitor spaces, walked into the ER in a camel coat and a set of pearls, and asked, without introducing herself, where her granddaughter was. Ray showed her. Sophie was sitting on an exam table between Janet Lawson and Hector, drinking apple juice through a bendy straw, her feet dangling 6 inches above the linoleum. Eleanor Whitmore looked at the child. Sophie looked back. There was no run to the grandmother's arms. There was no cry of relief. Sophie shrank against Janet's side and pressed her cheek into Hector's shoulder and did not say a single word. Janet noticed. Ray noticed. Dr. Chen noticed. Eleanor Whitmore noticed that they had noticed, and something small and hard moved behind her eyes. "I'll take her home," she said. "She has been through enough. Her mother will be released, one presumes, in a matter of hours, and there is no need to make a spectacle." Dr. Chen cleared his throat. He explained very politely that Laurie Morrow would not be released for at least 72 hours. He explained more politely still that the collapse she had suffered was consistent with a specific kind of adverse drug interaction and that they were running toxicology to confirm. He did not, at that moment, use the word poisoning. He watched Eleanor Whitmore's face when he said adverse drug interaction, and he watched it very carefully, and he could not have said afterward exactly what he saw there. Only that it had not been surprise. Janet caught Ray's eye across the room. Ray tipped his chin down, half an inch, meaning yes, he had seen it too. Sophie would not release Hector's ear. When a nurse tried gently to slide the child down from the exam table so grandmother could take her hand, Sophie began to shake. It was not a tantrum. It was a full-body tremor, the kind that comes from a place older than words, and Hector planted himself in front of the child and did not growl, but also did not move. Janet, quietly, asked the nurse to give them a minute. Eleanor Whitmore's mouth compressed to a thread. She spoke to Ray as if Janet were not in the room. "Officer, the child is not thinking clearly. She has attached herself to that animal because she is frightened. Please instruct your colleague to remove the dog, and I will take Sophie home to a warm bath and her own bed." Ray Delaney, who had done 14 years in this uniform and knew exactly how much authority he did and did not have, said very evenly that until Sophie's mother could speak for herself, and until the department had ruled out whether any crime had been committed on the front lawn on Sycamore Drive that morning, the child would remain in protective observation at the hospital, and the K9 could stay with her as long as she needed him. Eleanor Whitmore looked at Ray for a long moment. Then she smiled. It was the smile of someone who is filing information away for later. "Very well," she said. "I will contact my attorney and be back within the hour." She left. The double doors sighed shut behind her. The temperature in the corridor seemed to rise a full degree. Janet exhaled through her nose. Ray rubbed the back of his neck. Sophie let go of Hector's ear just long enough to point at the doors, and in a voice barely louder than a mouse said her first full sentence of the day. "She's not nice." Janet crouched down. "Who is she, sweetheart? Do you know her name?" Sophie nodded. "Grandma Ellie. Mommy calls her the Ice Lady when she doesn't know I'm listening. She wants to take me, but Daddy wouldn't let her. Daddy's dogs came to help." Janet froze. Daddy's dogs. She looked at Hector. Hector, whose file at the K9 unit began 3 years ago, when he was purchased at 14 months old from a private handler in Columbus. Hector, whose paperwork listed a first owner Janet had never bothered to look at, because she had never had a reason to. She looked at Ray. Ray looked back. Neither of them said the thing they were both thinking, because Sophie was 4 years old and her mother was 2 floors up, and there were 100 harmless ways a small child might mean the words "daddy's dogs." There were also 1 or 2 ways that were not harmless at all. That evening, after Sophie fell asleep in a pediatric room with Hector curled at the foot of the bed, Janet drove back to the K9 kennels and opened Hector's binder for the first time in a year. She flipped past the vet records and the training logs and the transfer papers and stopped at the very first page, the intake sheet from June of 2023, and read the name of the person the department had bought him from. Sold by private party. Nathan D. Morrow. Millbrook, Ohio. The kennel was quiet. The fluorescent light over her desk buzzed. She read the name 3 times before she believed it. Then she pulled her phone out of her pocket and typed the name into her department search bar with hands that were not quite steady. Nathan D. Morrow. Male, 34 years old at time of report. Millbrook Fire Department, Engine Company 7. Reported missing on the morning of April 11th, 2024, from the site of a chemical warehouse fire on the industrial edge of town. Presumed deceased. Body never recovered. Case marked closed 6 months later, 14 months ago. Nate Morrow, Sophie Morrow's father, had walked into a burning warehouse and had never walked out. Janet sat with the binder open in her lap and the department report on her phone screen and stared at nothing for a long time. Then she made 2 phone calls. The first was to Ray Delaney. The second was to a man she had not spoken to in almost 5 years, a detective named Alan Reyes, who had transferred out of Millbrook to the State Investigative Bureau in Columbus and who owed her a favor. She told Alan everything: the bus, the dogs, the child under the wheel, the mother collapsed on the lawn, the grandmother with the pearls, the name Nathan Morrow on the intake sheet of the K9 that had refused to move. Alan Reyes listened without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a full 10 seconds, which for Alan Reyes was the equivalent of another man yelling. "Janet," he said, "that fire, in April last year, the chemical warehouse, yeah? There was an insurance investigation, quiet one, never made the news. The company that owned the warehouse was a shell, and the shell was owned by a trust, and the trust was administered by a law firm in Toledo that only had 1 client we could ever pin down." Janet's throat went dry. "Who?" "Whitmore Holdings. Eleanor Whitmore, sole trustee." Janet did not speak for a long moment. In the corner of the kennel, Rex, who had come back for the night, lifted his head off his paws and looked at her. "Alan," she said finally, "I need you to come to Millbrook tomorrow." "I'll be there by 9, he said, and hung up. That was the first turn of the screw. There would be many more. Phil Carver did not sleep that night. He sat on the edge of his bed at 2:10 in the morning with the lamp still on and his uniform still on, and stared at the small, silver-framed picture on the nightstand. His late wife, Marlene, gone 6 years now. His daughter Kate at her college graduation, his own reflection in the glass, the lines under his eyes deeper than he remembered them being yesterday. He kept seeing the little pink coat under the wheel. He kept hearing the whimper he had not heard. He kept feeling the moment his boot had been about to press down. He got up at 4, made a pot of coffee too strong to drink, and sat at the kitchen table with an old road atlas open in front of him, for no reason he could name. He kept turning to the page for Millbrook and running his thumb along Sycamore Drive, as if the paper would tell him something the pavement had not. Around 5:30, he did something he had not done in 7 years. He picked up the phone and called Kate, his daughter, and she answered on the second ring because a call from her father at that hour meant one of 2 things, and she knew it. "Dad." "What is it?" "Are you okay?" He told her, all of it, the dogs, the bus, the child. His voice held until he got to the wheel, and then it did not. Kate listened to her father cry for the first time in her adult life. She did not interrupt. When he was done, she said very softly, "Dad, you didn't hurt her, you didn't. Do you hear me? You saw her because they made you see her." "I keep thinking," he said. "I keep thinking about every morning I never looked." "Then look now," she said. "Look now, Dad. Go see her. Go see that little girl if the hospital lets you. Tell her you're glad she's okay. That's the only way this stops being a nightmare and starts being something else." Phil Carver hung up the phone. He drank a glass of water. He put on a clean shirt and drove to Millbrook General at 7:15 in the morning with a small plush bear he had bought at the 24-hour drugstore on Route 6 and no earthly idea what he was going to say. He asked at the desk if he could see the little girl who had been brought in the morning before. The nurse asked his name. He said, "Phil Carver." The nurse looked at her screen and then looked back at him, and her whole face changed. "Sir," she said, "sit down. I'll be right back." She came back with a woman in a rumpled hospital gown, an IV pole rolling beside her, her hair pulled back with what looked like a rubber band from a produce bag. Lorrie Morrow was 5'3", 31 years old, and awake for the first time in almost 20 hours. She had heard about him already. She stopped in front of his chair and looked down at him, and her eyes filled up but did not spill. "You're the driver," she said. He nodded. He could not find words. She held out her hand. He took it. Her fingers were cold and thin. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for not moving." He tried 3 times before he could speak. "I didn't do anything. It was the dogs. I would have." She squeezed his hand. Hard. Harder than a woman with an IV in her arm should have been able to squeeze. "Mr. Carver," she said, "please listen to me. My daughter is alive. My daughter is alive, and it doesn't matter to me right now what the mechanism was. You are part of the reason. You get to be part of the reason. Say yes." "Yes," he said. And that was when he cried in front of a stranger in a hospital lobby, and Lorrie Morrow, who had been crying on and off since the previous afternoon, sat down in the chair next to him and cried with him for a little while, and then she wiped her face with the sleeve of the hospital gown and said, "Would you like to come meet Sophie?" He nodded. He could not have refused her anything. Sophie was sitting cross-legged on the pediatric bed in a fresh set of hospital pajamas with dinosaurs on them, brushing Hector's ears with her fingers as if he were a very large stuffed animal. Rex was on the floor beside the bed. Janet Lawson was in the chair by the window. Ray Delaney was leaning against the doorframe. When Lorrie walked in with Phil, Sophie looked up and considered him with the grave, honest attention of a small child. And after what felt to Phil like a long minute, she said, "You drove the bus?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. "That was me." "The puppies knew," Sophie said. She stroked Hector's forehead. "My daddy trained him. He said Hector was the smartest dog in the whole city." Lorrie Morrow, standing beside Phil, made a sound in her throat, and then she sat down very carefully on the foot of the bed. She put her hand on Sophie's ankle. She looked at Janet. She looked at Ray. She looked at Hector, who looked back at her with the kind of steady attention that dogs give only to people they know. "Oh," she said, and her whole face broke open. "Oh, that's you. That's you, isn't it? That's Hector. Nate's Hector." Janet crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt down beside the bed and took Lorrie's free hand, because the woman was starting to shake. "Mom," Janet said, "we need to talk. There is more going on here than a bus stop." Lorrie Morrow looked her in the face. She nodded once, then she said, in a voice that was steady but very low, so Sophie could keep brushing Hector's ears without hearing, "I know. I have known for a long time, and I didn't tell anyone because I couldn't prove it. And I think that is why I am in this hospital bed today. That was the first crack in the wall. Alan Reyes arrived from Columbus at 8:45, half an hour ahead of schedule, wearing the same brown blazer he had been wearing 5 years ago and carrying a manila folder that was thicker than it should have been. He shook hands with Janet in the parking lot. He nodded at Ray. He was introduced to Phil, whom he studied for exactly 2 seconds longer than a polite introduction required, and Phil had the distinct sense of being read the way a man reads a map. They took over an unused conference room on the 2nd floor. Dr. Chen joined them halfway through, which surprised everyone except Alan, who had asked him to come. Laurie sat at the head of the table with a cup of hospital coffee she did not drink. Sophie was in the pediatric room with a very sweet nurse named Denise and Hector, who had made it clear by lying across the doorway that no one was coming or going without his permission. Lori Morrow began at the beginning, because the middle would not make sense without it. She had met Nathan Morrow 12 years earlier at a fundraiser for the Millbrook Fire Department. He had been 22, freshly badged, the golden son of Eleanor and Robert Whitmore. Robert had died the year before Lori met Nate. Robert had been the human being in that family, Lori said quietly. He had been a good man. Eleanor had married him for money that turned out to be his family's money and not hers, and when he died, the family money became her money, and she had not become a kinder person for it. Nate had insisted on being called Morrow instead of Whitmore from the day he turned 18. He had taken his father's surname, the one Eleanor had legally shed after Robert's death, and he had never used the Whitmore name again. Eleanor had never forgiven him. She had refused to attend the wedding. She had sent, in place of a gift, a letter to Laurie's parents suggesting that Laurie was after the family trust. Laurie's parents, who lived in a small farming town outside Dayton and had never had 2 spare nickels to rub together, had burned the letter in the kitchen sink. Nate and Laurie had lived quietly. Nate had joined Engine 7 at the fire station and had been happy there. He had bought Hector as a puppy from a breeder in Columbus who trained working shepherds, because he had always wanted to help start a canine program at the fire station for search and rescue. He had trained Hector himself, at home, in the yard, every morning before shift and every evening after. Sophie had learned to walk with one hand on Hector's collar. Laurie paused there. Her eyes were wet. Then the fire. April 11th, 2024. A chemical warehouse on the north edge of town, on land that had been sitting empty for years and had recently been leased through a chain of paper companies to a firm that stored industrial solvents. There had been reports of illegal storage. There had been an anonymous tip about tampered ventilation. Engine 7 had rolled out at 3:40 in the morning. Nate had gone in with 2 other firefighters to check for a night watchman. The other 2 had come out. Nate had not. A section of ceiling had collapsed, then a wall, then the whole east side of the structure had gone up in a way the fire marshal later described in his report as consistent with an accelerant placement rather than a spontaneous chemical reaction. The report had been filed. The report had been quietly reshelved. No one had ever been charged. The warehouse had been leveled within 2 weeks, the site graded flat, and a for sale sign put up. The insurance had paid out to the trust that owned the shell that owned the warehouse. Nate Morrow had been declared legally deceased 6 months later, on the last day of October. At a hearing Eleanor Whitmore had attended and Laurie had not, because Laurie had refused to sign the paperwork and had been fighting the declaration in probate court. Alan Reyes set the manila folder on the table. He opened it. He slid across a photograph of an aerial view of the warehouse footprint taken by the state fire marshal 3 days after the fire. He slid across a second photograph, taken from the same angle 2 weeks later, of the same lot smoothed to bare earth. He slid across a third document, a chain of title, showing that the land had changed hands 2 months later for $112,000, from Whitmore Holdings to a developer in Cincinnati. Laurie looked at the papers. Her hands began to shake. Alan very gently said, "Mrs. Morrow, there is more. I don't know if you want to hear it in front of everyone." "Yes," she said. "Yes, I do. If any of these people can help my family, I want them to know what they are walking into." Alan nodded. He turned a page. "In the 8 months since your husband was declared deceased," he said, 3 separate individuals have anonymously contacted the state fire marshal's tip line about the warehouse fire. 2 of them recanted within a week. 1 of them disappeared, not vanished, disappeared, sold his house in Perrysburg in the middle of the night and moved out of state without leaving a forwarding address. That was 3 months ago. Laurie swallowed. Who was he? Alan looked up from the page. His name was Michael Delacroix. He was, until December, Chief Operations Officer at Whitmore Holdings. The room was very quiet. Dr. Chen was staring at the table. Janet was staring at Alan. Ray was staring at Laurie. Phil, who had said nothing since sitting down and had no professional business being in the room at all, was staring at his own hands. He had gone very still, in the way old truck drivers go still when they are listening as hard as they can. Laurie spoke first. "And now," she said, "I collapse on my own front lawn." "Yes," said Dr. Chen. His voice was low. "Your toxicology came back an hour ago, Mrs. Morrow. Your blood contained a therapeutic dose of a beta blocker you do not take, and a therapeutic dose of a blood pressure medication you also do not take. Together, in the concentrations you had, they would have dropped your blood pressure exactly as we saw. In a smaller person, or in someone with any pre-existing cardiac weakness, they would have been fatal. It is my medical opinion that you did not take these substances knowingly." Laurie closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them, she said, "I had breakfast at my mother-in-law's house yesterday morning. She insisted. She said Sophie needed to spend more time with her grandmother. She poured me coffee." The silence in the room hummed. Alan Reyes made a small, careful note in his folder. "That is the second cup of coffee," he said quietly. "That is the second cup of coffee in 6 months at that house." Laurie nodded. "And I felt off both times. I told myself it was grief. I told myself it was exhaustion. I told myself I was imagining things because I could not bear to believe what I was starting to believe, which was that she wants Sophie," Laurie said. "She wants my daughter, and she cannot legally take her while I am alive and well. She has tried twice through the courts. Both times a judge said no, because I am employed and stable, and Sophie is loved. So now she is trying another way." Alan nodded. He wrote something else in the folder. Then he looked at Janet and said, "Officer, I would like you to place a protective detail on Sophie Morrow effective immediately, and on her mother effective the moment she is discharged. Ray, I need you to sit on Eleanor Whitmore's house today, discreetly, and log every vehicle that comes and goes. I am going to Columbus tonight to file paperwork for a search warrant. In the meantime, no one in this room says a word of this outside this room. Are we agreed?" Everyone nodded. Even Phil, who was not part of any of it, and who understood in that moment that he had just walked into something that would not release him until it was finished. That afternoon, Eleanor Whitmore came back to the hospital with her attorney, a soft-voiced man in a grey suit named Landry, and requested a private meeting with the head of pediatric services. She wanted, she said, to file a formal petition for temporary custody of her granddaughter on grounds that the child's mother was clearly a danger to herself and to the child, having suffered a collapse of unclear origin in the child's presence and being at present hospitalized under sedation. She had a document prepared. She had a driver in the car. She had, she said, a spare bedroom already made up. The head of pediatric services listened. Then she said very politely that the mother of the child was in fact awake, alert, oriented, and had already spoken to the attending physician about her preferences regarding her daughter's care. She invited Mrs. Whitmore and Mr. Landry to sit in the waiting area while Mrs. Morrow was consulted. Eleanor Whitmore's face did not change. She thanked the physician. She sat in the waiting area for exactly 9 minutes, during which she made 2 phone calls in a voice too low to overhear. Then she stood up, told her attorney they were leaving, and walked out. Ray Delaney, sitting in an unmarked car across the hospital parking lot, wrote down the time she left and the direction she turned. He followed her, at a distance, back to a 2-story colonial on Whitmore Lane, a road named after her late husband's grandfather. He parked 3 houses down. He waited. At 6:17 that evening, a black sedan with dealer plates pulled into the driveway. A man got out. He was tall and lean and wore a dark coat and a hat pulled low. He carried a briefcase. He went into the house. He came out 40 minutes later without the briefcase. He drove away. Ray radioed the plate to dispatch. The plate was registered to a rental agency in Toledo. The name on the rental was Michael Delacroix. Michael Delacroix, who had disappeared 3 months earlier, was back in Ohio. Ray Delaney called Alan Reyes on his cell phone. Alan Reyes, who was already halfway to Columbus, turned around and drove back to Millbrook. That was the third turn of the screw. Meanwhile, in the pediatric room, something small and strange was happening. Sophie Morrow, who had barely spoken to anyone besides her mother and Hector for a day and a half, sat up in the bed and looked at Janet Lawson and said, "Officer Janet, can I tell you a secret?" Janet, who had been dozing in the visitor chair, sat up straight. "Of course, sweetheart." Sophie put her mouth close to Hector's ear, as if the dog were part of the conversation. She whispered, "Daddy is not gone. Daddy sent the puppies. Daddy is far away, but he is not gone." Janet's mouth went dry. She kept her voice light. "Sophie, honey, what makes you say that?" "Because," Sophie said, with the perfect logic of a 4-year-old, "Hector wouldn't come without Daddy. Hector is Daddy's dog. If Daddy was gone, Hector would be sad. Hector is not sad. Hector came to save me. That means Daddy sent him." Janet Lawson sat with that for a long moment. She reminded herself that Sophie was 4 and that grief in a small child follows its own strange arithmetic. Children, she knew, invent stories to hold the pieces of a world that is broken. Sophie's father was dead. Sophie's father had been dead for over a year. Every rational fiber of Janet's 12 years on the force told her so. But then she looked at Hector, and Hector was watching Sophie with the exact attention he gave a suspect coming out of a doorway. And she thought about Nate Morrow's name on the intake sheet. And she thought about the man in the dark coat carrying a briefcase into Eleanor Whitmore's house. And she thought about the coffee cup Laurie had described, and about the anonymous tip that had recanted, and about the operations officer who had disappeared and then reappeared. She sat forward slowly. "Sweetheart," she said, "when did Daddy tell you he was sending the puppies?" Sophie thought about it. She turned Hector's ear over between her fingers. "Last night," she said, "in my dream." But sometimes dreams are just remembering. Janet did not sleep that night either. The next morning, Alan Reyes came in with a face like a locked door. He asked Janet, Ray, Dr. Chen, and Laurie to meet him in the conference room again. Phil was not there this time because Phil was on his morning route, but he would be brought in later. Alan set a photograph on the table. It was a still frame from a low-quality security camera. The angle was high, the image was grainy. But the face of the tall man in the dark coat carrying the briefcase up Eleanor Whitmore's driveway the previous evening was clearly visible. "That is Michael Delacroix," Alan said, "former COO of Whitmore Holdings. Last known address until December in Perrysburg. Confirmed dead by the state of Michigan 2 weeks ago." Everyone stared at him. "Confirmed dead," he repeated, "per a body pulled from a car crash on I-94 outside Ann Arbor, February 28th. The identification was made off dental records provided by a private dentist in Toledo whose entire practice, we discovered this morning, has been closed since 2022. The dental records were forged. The body was not Michael Delacroix. It was another man, height and weight approximate, no ID, whose face was unrecoverable from the crash. That case is now reopened. Which means, Ray said slowly, which means, Alan said, that Michael Delacroix has been walking around under a dead man's shadow for 6 weeks. And which means that whoever helped him do it has resources and reach. And which means that yesterday, at 6:17 in the evening, Michael Delacroix walked into the home of Eleanor Whitmore with a briefcase and walked out without it. Laurie sat with her hand over her mouth. Alan turned to her. "Mrs. Morrow, I have to ask you a difficult question. Your husband's body was never recovered from that fire." "No," she said. Her voice was almost inaudible. "Have you ever, in the 14 months since he was declared dead, received any communication, any at all, that made you wonder, you? She was silent for a long time. Then she said, there was a package 2 months ago sent to my house. No return address, postmarked from Charleston, West Virginia. Inside was a small silver key, no note, nothing else. It fit no lock in my house. I put it in the drawer with Sophie's baby teeth, and I told myself it was a mistake, that it had been meant for someone else. Alan Reyes closed his eyes for 1 second. When he opened them, he said, Mrs. Morrow, I need that key. Today. Ray drove Laurie to her house under escort. She retrieved the key from the drawer. It was small and old-fashioned, brass with a silver plating, the kind that opens a lockbox rather than a door. Alan turned it over in his palm for a long time in the conference room. Then he made a phone call to a colleague in the state records office. He read a serial number off the shank of the key. He hung up. He waited. The colleague called back 40 minutes later. The key fit a safe deposit box at a small credit union in Charleston, West Virginia. The box had been rented 6 months ago under the name Nathan Morrow. The rental fee had been paid in cash. The box had been opened and closed 3 times since. The most recent opening had been 11 days ago. The room went so quiet Phil, who had come in during the call, could hear the tick of the clock on the wall. Laurie sat down. She did not cry. She was past crying. She said, "He is alive." Alan Reyes nodded once. "It appears so." Laurie made a sound that was half laugh and half sob and half something else, something Phil had never heard a human being make before. Then she straightened her back and said, in a voice steadier than any voice in that room had a right to be, "Then someone tried to kill him and failed, and that someone is my mother-in-law, and that someone tried to kill me 2 days ago and would have taken my daughter yesterday. Detective, what do you need from me?" Alan Reyes, who was not a sentimental man, looked at her with something very close to admiration. He said, "I need you to do nothing except stay in this hospital and stay safe. I need Janet to keep Sophie in that room. I need Ray to stay on the Whitmore house. And I need a warrant, which I'm going to file for in Columbus this afternoon, and which I'm going to have signed by tonight, because a judge I know very well owes me a very large favor." He did not, in that moment, say the other thing he was going to do. He did not say that he was going to send a colleague to Charleston, West Virginia, that afternoon to open a safe deposit box. He did that, too. While all of that was moving, back on Sycamore Drive, Phil Carver was driving his afternoon route in a state of quiet dread. Every parent at every stop knew what had happened. Some of them thanked him. One of them cried. One of them asked him, in a low voice, whether the little girl was all right. He said yes. He did not say anything else. He drove 25 miles an hour the whole way and stopped 4 full seconds at every stop sign. At 3:50, at the corner of Sycamore and Wren, the exact spot where Hector and Rex had planted themselves 2 mornings earlier, Phil pulled the bus over and stopped. He was not scheduled to stop there in the afternoons. He killed the engine. He sat for a full minute with his forehead against the top of the steering wheel. Then he got out and walked to the front of the bus and stood on the pavement where he had stood before. There was a small pile of teddy bears and flowers on the curb. People had been leaving them since yesterday. A handwritten note in a child's crayon said, "Thank you, doggies." Another card said, "God bless." A little stuffed rabbit, not Sophie's but very like it, sat on top of the pile, with one plastic eye reflecting the afternoon sun. Phil stood there for a long moment. Then he did something he had not done since Marlene died. He prayed, not for himself, for the little girl in the pediatric room, for the mother who had crawled toward a phone before she blacked out, for the father who might be alive somewhere and who might not know that his family was in danger, for the 2 dogs who had done in one morning what a whole department had not done in a year. He prayed for all of them, standing in the road with his hat in his hand. Then he got back on the bus and finished his route. That evening at 6:47, Alan Reyes' colleague in Charleston opened the safe deposit box at the small credit union with a fresh warrant in his hand. Inside the box was a leather-bound notebook, a portable hard drive, and a single sealed envelope addressed simply to Laurie and Sophie. The colleague did not open the envelope. He photographed the notebook cover to cover. He cloned the hard drive, and he sent the images and the clone to Alan Reyes's encrypted email inbox before the hour was up. Alan Reyes sat in his rental car in the Millbrook General parking lot at 9 that night and read the notebook. It was a journal, written in careful, tight handwriting, dated entries from April 12, 2024, the day after the warehouse fire, through the previous week. It described the writer's escape from the collapsing warehouse through a rear service tunnel that no one but the fire department mapping team was supposed to know existed. It described his realization, in the hours after, that the fire had been set. It described his decision in the days after to stay hidden until he understood who had set it and why. It described his slow, patient investigation into Whitmore Holdings, into the shell companies, into the trust, into his own mother, whom the writer had for years suspected of being colder than most people knew, but whom he had never suspected of being capable of what he was slowly discovering. His mother, Eleanor, who had systematically bought and hidden and then torched a warehouse that had been used for 18 months as an unlicensed storage facility for stolen prescription pharmaceuticals moved out of a network operating between Cleveland and Detroit. His mother, who had gone into partnership with people he did not name in the journal, but whose operations he tracked in pages of neatly hand-drawn diagrams. His mother, who had ordered the fire when a whistleblower inside her own operation had begun to talk to the state fire marshal's office. Nate Morrow had been in the warehouse that night because he had been the one investigating the whistleblower's tip on his own time. The journal was signed at the bottom of every page with the same 3 letters. NDM. At the very end, in an entry dated 11 days earlier, Nate Morrow had written a single paragraph. I have enough now. I am coming home in 10 days. I have arranged for a colleague to deliver this notebook to Laurie through a chain of hands if I do not make it back. If you are reading this and I am not there to read it with you, I love you more than any word will ever hold, and I am so sorry for the year of silence. I could not risk a phone call. I could not risk a letter. If my mother knew I was alive, she would have finished what she started, and she would have taken Sophie. I stayed away to keep you both alive. 10 days from tomorrow, I will be at the old covered bridge on County Road 14 at 7 in the morning. Please come. Alan Reyes looked at his watch. It was 9:16 p.m. on the 16th of October. 10 days from the entry date would be the 17th. Tomorrow morning at 7, a man who had been legally dead for over a year was going to walk out of the tree line at a covered bridge on County Road 14. And if Eleanor Whitmore had somehow learned that he was coming, if Michael Delacroix, walking into her house with a briefcase, had brought her that information, then someone was going to be waiting there for him with something a great deal worse than a welcome. Alan Reyes started his car and drove to the hospital and walked into the conference room and told Janet, Ray, Laurie, Dr. Chen, and Phil Carver, because by now Phil was in the room too, at the request of Laurie herself, who said she wanted him there for reasons she could not put into words, everything he had just learned. Laurie Morrow, at the end of the reading, put her hands over her face. She sat that way for a full minute. When she took her hands down, her eyes were dry and hard and clear. We are going to the bridge, she said, all of us, tomorrow morning, and no one is going to be waiting there but the people who love him. Alan Reyes said, Mrs. Morrow, I can't authorize you to be at that scene. She looked at him. Then don't authorize it. But I will be there. He is my husband. He is Sophie's father. And after 14 months of thinking I had lost him, I will meet him at that bridge or I will die trying. Alan Reyes was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "All right, we do this together, and we do it right." The plan was assembled in 3 hours. Janet Lawson and Ray Delaney would be at the bridge with a small team from the county SWAT unit in position by 4 in the morning, hidden in the tree line on the west side of the creek. Alan Reyes would coordinate from a mobile command post half a mile up the road. A Millbrook patrol car would be posted at each end of County Road 14. A second team would sit on Eleanor Whitmore's house from midnight onward. Laurie Morrow would ride to the bridge with Janet in the back of an unmarked vehicle, low, and she would not step out until Nate was in her arms. Phil Carver, who had absolutely no operational reason to be there, asked if he could drive one of the patrol cars. Alan Reyes looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Mr. Carver, you have never driven a police vehicle in your life, have you?" "No, sir," said Phil, "but I have driven a 15-ton bus down every road in this county for 23 years, in fog, in snow, in ice, and on the shoulder of Route 6 at 3 a.m., when a deer wandered out. If you need someone to sit at the mouth of that road and stop anything that tries to come down it, I am your man." Alan Reyes did something rare. He smiled. "All right, Mr. Carver, you take the West End. You stop anything that isn't us." "Yes, sir." Hector and Rex, who had not left Sophie's side, would stay at the hospital under the care of Denise, the pediatric nurse. Sophie herself was told none of it. She was told only that her mother had to go out very early to meet a friend and would be back before breakfast, and that Hector would stay with her the whole time. Sophie accepted this with the philosophical calm of a 4-year-old who had spent 2 days in a hospital bed with a police dog for company. At 3:57 in the morning on the 17th of October, Officer Ray Delaney, sitting in his unmarked car half a block from Eleanor Whitmore's house, watched a dark SUV back slowly out of her driveway with its headlights off. He radioed. Alan Reyes, in the mobile command post, took the call. He confirmed. The SUV had 2 occupants, Michael Delacroix at the wheel, a second man in the passenger seat, unidentified. They turned south. They headed toward County Road 14. They had been told. Somehow, they had been told. Alan Reyes tightened his grip on the radio. He gave the order. "Everyone go dark. Everyone hold position. We take them at the bridge." At 6:32 in the morning, in a stand of birches on the west bank of the creek, Officer Janet Lawson lay on her belly beside her partner and watched the pale sky over the covered bridge slowly lighten from grey to bone white. Fog hung along the water. The bridge itself, an old wooden structure with a peaked roof, looked exactly like every postcard photograph of small-town Ohio ever printed. It had been closed to vehicles for a decade, pedestrians only. Nate Morrow had chosen it because it was quiet and known only to locals. At 6:49, the dark SUV crawled up the far end of County Road 14 with its headlights off. It stopped 100 yards from the bridge. 2 men got out. Both were in dark coats. Both were carrying long, thin objects that Janet did not need her binoculars to identify. They moved toward the bridge with practiced, quiet steps. At 6:51, a man on foot appeared at the tree line on the eastern side of the creek. He was tall, he was lean. He had a beard he had not had 14 months ago, and his hair was longer, and there was a slight limp in his left leg. He wore a canvas jacket and a wool cap. He carried nothing but a small, worn backpack. Nate Morrow stepped out into the open and began to walk toward the bridge. 200 feet away, in the mouth of the bridge, the 2 men in dark coats crouched down. Nate did not see them. He was walking home. His eyes were on the road, on the wooden planks of the bridge, on the pale light coming through the slats. Behind him, the birds were starting to sing. Janet whispered into her radio. Now, 6 shapes rose out of the tree line on the west bank in perfect silence and moved onto the bridge from the west end at the same instant that Ray's team moved onto the road from the east. The 2 men in dark coats had, at most, 4 seconds to understand what was happening. Michael Delacroix turned first. He raised what he was carrying. Officer Ray Delaney, who had been a marksman in the army before he had ever put on a police uniform, put a single, controlled shot into Delacroix's forearm from 22 feet away, and Delacroix's weapon spun across the wooden planks and clattered off the side of the bridge and into the creek. The second man raised his hands so fast, his knees hit the boards. Nate Morrow stopped where he stood. He had heard the shot. He looked up. He saw 6 officers in tactical gear on the bridge. He saw 2 men on the ground. He saw, on the west bank, in the pale white light of the October dawn, a small figure in a black coat step out from behind the unmarked vehicle and begin to run toward him. Laurie. He said her name once. He said it quietly. And then he was running too, badly, with the limp but running, and they met in the middle of the covered bridge with the smell of wet wood and river water around them, and neither of them said anything for a long time. At the west end of County Road 14, sitting in the driver's seat of a Millbrook patrol car with his hands at 10 and 2, Phil Carver heard the report over the radio. Suspects in custody. Objective secured. Family reunited. He put his head down against the steering wheel for a moment, then he lifted it, and he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, and he radioed back a simple copy. The rest was paperwork, and it was long and it was heavy, but it moved with a kind of inevitability that only comes when everyone in a room already knows what is true. Michael Delacroix, in exchange for a reduced sentence, agreed to testify. He gave up names, he gave up dates, he gave up the location of a second warehouse in Toledo. He gave up the exact phone call Eleanor Whitmore had made to him the previous afternoon, the moment she realized her son was alive, the moment she gave the order. Eleanor Whitmore was arrested at 7:42 the next morning at her home on Whitmore Lane. She was wearing the same camel coat and the same pearls. She was informed of her rights on her own front porch. She did not resist. She did not speak. Her attorney arrived within the hour. He looked as though he had slept in his suit. Her trial lasted 11 weeks. The prosecution brought Nate Morrow's journal into evidence. It brought the hard drive from the safe deposit box. It brought Michael Delacroix onto the stand. It brought Dr. Marcus Chen and Detective Alan Reyes and Officer Janet Lawson and Officer Ray Delaney and, on a Wednesday afternoon in late January, Phil Carver, who was called only to testify about what he had seen on Sycamore Drive on the morning of October 15th, and who spoke for 11 minutes and left the courtroom without looking at Eleanor Whitmore once. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Eleanor Whitmore was found guilty on 21 counts, including arson, conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, obstruction of justice, and 2 counts of poisoning. Judge Patricia Hollis sentenced her to consecutive terms, totaling 94 years in state custody. She would not, at 71 years old, walk out of prison alive. The remaining members of the pharmaceutical distribution network were rolled up over the following 6 months in a joint operation between the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation and the Drug Enforcement Administration. 14 people went to federal prison. 2 lives insurance policies Eleanor Whitmore had taken out on her son and daughter-in-law were voided. The Whitmore estate was placed in trust, half for the ongoing legal restitution and half in a scholarship fund for children of firefighters. The trust was administered by, of all people, Laurie Morrow herself, at the request of a family court judge who had watched her testify and had thought privately that this was a woman who deserved to see her name on something good. Nate Morrow spent 3 weeks in the hospital recovering from an infection in his left leg that he had been managing on the road for months. He gained back 11 pounds. He sat by his daughter's bed every day and read her the same picture book about a bear who lost his hat and found it over and over because it was the one she wanted. He held his wife's hand while she slept. He cried, quietly, without shame, whenever no one was looking, and sometimes when they were. On the day he came home to the little house on Aspen Court, Sophie met him at the front door in her pink puffer coat. She looked up at him with her pale, grey-green eyes and considered him gravely, in the way she considered everything. Then she said, "You took a long time." "I did," he said. "I'm sorry. Hector is here," she said. "I know. He came before you. I know that too. I sent him ahead. I told him to watch you until I could come back." Sophie thought about that for a moment. Then she nodded, satisfied. She put her small hand in his large one and led him into the house. Hector padded behind them. Rex followed. The door closed. The light in the living room went on. A woman across the street, watering a pot of chrysanthemums on her porch, watched it happen and put her hand over her mouth and did not know why she was crying. 6 months after the trial, on a soft spring morning, Phil Carver pulled the yellow school bus to the curb on Sycamore Drive at 7:12 on the dot. The maple tree over the curb was in full new leaf. There was no fog. The world smelled like wet earth and cut grass. He opened the folding door and checked his mirror, and then he checked it again, and then he checked the space in front of the bumper very carefully, the way he had checked it every morning for 6 months, and would check it every morning for the rest of his working life. There was no one under the wheel. There was, instead, standing on the sidewalk with a little pink backpack and a lunchbox with a picture of a bear on it, a small girl in a spring jacket, holding the hand of a tall, lean man with a slight limp. Behind them, sitting neatly on the grass strip between the sidewalk and the curb, was a German shepherd with a slightly greying muzzle, watching the bus with the exact serious attention he had always given it. Nate Morrow lifted his daughter's hand in a small wave. Phil Carver, in the driver's seat, lifted his own hand back. Sophie climbed the 2 rubber steps in her light-up sneakers. She waved at her father. She waved at Hector. She walked to the 3rd seat on the left and sat down. Phil watched her in the mirror for a long moment. Then he looked once more at the pavement in front of him, at the empty stretch of asphalt where a little girl had once curled in a pink coat with a stuffed rabbit. And he thought about how 23 years had taught him that a road is never empty just because you cannot see anything on it. Some mornings the thing you cannot see is a child. Some mornings the thing you cannot see is a dog with a job. Some mornings the thing you cannot see is a father coming home from a year of walking through the dark. He closed the folding door. He signaled. He pulled slowly, carefully away from the curb, and Sycamore Drive rolled by his window in the soft new light of a spring morning that had been earned, twist, by every single person who had refused to look away. If this story moved you, take a second right now to tap that like button and tell me in the comments what you would have done in Phil Carver's shoes when he stood on that pavement and understood what he had almost done. Share this video with the person in your life who most needs to be reminded that paying attention is a form of love. And subscribe to the channel because there are more stories like this one coming, and I do not want you to miss a single one. Because sometimes the smallest pause, a single second longer at a bus stop, a single glance at a mirror, a single choice to listen when 2 dogs will not move, is the difference between a morning that ends in tragedy and a morning that ends with a family, whole, walking home together into the light.